The congressional hearing room fell silent as Representative Jasmine Crockett calmly pulled a folder from her briefcase. For months, Matt Gaetz had dominated headlines with his aggressive questioning of witnesses and bold claims about government accountability. But today, the tables had turned. "Representative Gaetz," Crockett said, her voice steady and clear, "you've repeatedly positioned yourself as a champion of transparency and accountability. Is that correct?" Gaetz leaned confidently into his microphone. "Absolutely. The American people deserve nothing less." What happened next left the entire chamber speechless. In just 30 seconds, Crockett would present evidence that not only contradicted Gaetz's public image, but revealed a pattern that would leave him fumbling for words on national television. As committee members' eyes widened, cameras captured the exact moment Gaetz realized he had walked into a trap of his own making. If you're tired of political theater without substance, hit that subscribe button now because we're about to show you one of the most methodical takedowns ever witnessed in Congress. Before this momentous confrontation, both representatives had traveled very different paths to Congress. Matt Gaetz, 42, had cultivated a reputation as a firebrand. The son of a prominent Florida politician, he had risen quickly through state politics before winning his congressional seat. With frequent television appearances and provocative statements, Gaetz had positioned himself as a fearless truth-teller willing to challenge anyone, regardless of party or position. His supporters praised his boldness while critics questioned his substance. "I'm here to drain the swamp," Gaetz often declared in interviews and at rallies. "Washington is full of hypocrites who say one thing and do another." This particular House Oversight Committee hearing had been convened to investigate government accountability measures, a topic Gaetz had frequently championed. Just the previous week, he had delivered a fiery speech on the House floor about elected officials who fail to live up to their own standards. "The American people are sick and tired of politicians who preach from their pedestals while hiding their own failings," he had proclaimed to thunderous applause from his supporters. Representative Jasmine Crockett, 43, presented a striking contrast. A former civil rights attorney who had won major cases against government overreach, Crockett had built her career fighting for transparency in the justice system. Unlike Gaetz's privileged background, she had worked her way through law school while supporting her family. Her methodical, evidence-based approach had earned her respect across the aisle, even from those who disagreed with her politics. "In my courtroom experience," Crockett had explained in her first committee hearing, "I learned that facts matter more than performance. You can be the loudest voice in the room, but without evidence, you're just making noise." What Gaetz didn't know was that Crockett had spent weeks gathering information about his voting record, public statements, and legislative actions. Her legal background had taught her to build cases methodically, and she had applied those skills to prepare for this moment. The committee room that morning was packed with journalists, staffers, and citizens. C-SPAN cameras panned across the chamber, capturing the tension as Gaetz finished his opening remarks with his characteristic confidence. "We need representatives who stand for something," he declared, "who vote their conscience, not their convenience, who maintain consistency between their words and actions." As Gaetz finished, several Republican members nodded approvingly. He sat back with the satisfied look of someone who believed he had once again demonstrated his commitment to principle. That's when Chairman James called on Representative Crockett for her 5 minutes of questioning. "Do you remember when political debates were about substance rather than showmanship? Share your thoughts in the comments about a time when you witnessed someone being held accountable for their inconsistency. Your experiences help us build a community that values truth over performance." "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Crockett began, her voice measured and calm. The contrast with Gaetz's earlier passionate delivery was immediately noticeable. "And thank you, Representative Gaetz, for your willingness to participate in today's discussion on accountability." Gaetz nodded confidently. "Always happy to discuss accountability in government." "I'd like to start by confirming a few of your public positions," Crockett continued. "You've repeatedly stated that politicians should be judged by their actions rather than their words, correct?" "Absolutely," Gaetz replied. "Talk is cheap in Washington. It's what you do that matters." "And you've emphasized that consistency is a cornerstone of integrity in public service?" 100%, he agreed, looking completely at ease. Flip-flopping is the hallmark of the political class I came here to challenge. Crockett nodded, making notes. And you've specifically criticized colleagues who vote differently than they speak to their constituents. That's the definition of political hypocrisy, Gaetz said firmly. Saying one thing on camera and doing another with your vote. The room remained attentive but relaxed. These were standard positions that few would disagree with. Some committee members had begun checking their phones, assuming this would be another routine exchange. "Thank you for those clarifications," Crockett said. She opened the folder in front of her. "With those principles in mind, I'd like to examine your own record of consistency." Something in her tone caused several committee members to look up. Gaetz maintained his confident posture, but those watching closely noticed his fingers tightening slightly around his pen. "On March 12th of last year, you gave a speech in your district claiming, and I quote, 'I will never vote for increased surveillance of American citizens.' You called it government overreach at its worst." Crockett looked up from her notes. "Do you stand by that statement?" "Of course," Gaetz replied. "I've always defended Americans' privacy rights against government intrusion." Crockett nodded. "Yet 3 weeks later, you voted yes on H.R. 6126, which expanded domestic surveillance powers for federal agencies. The congressional record shows your vote as affirmative." Gaetz shifted slightly in his chair. "That bill had numerous provisions, and the final version included amendments that addressed my concerns about oversight." "I have the full text here," Crockett responded, holding up a document. "The final version contained the exact surveillance provisions you publicly opposed, without the oversight mechanisms you just mentioned." She continued without waiting for his response. "Similarly, last September, you told a town hall meeting in your district that you would never support sending more American dollars overseas while we have veterans sleeping on our streets. You received a standing ovation for that statement." Several Republican members nodded in agreement with the sentiment. "Yet 2 months later," Crockett continued, "you voted for H.R. 4758, which increased foreign aid by $2.7 billion, while voting against H.R. 3967, which would have expanded housing assistance for homeless veterans." The room grew quieter as committee members began paying closer attention. A journalist in the front row was frantically taking notes. "There was poison pill language in the Veterans Bill," Gaetz countered, his earlier ease now visibly strained. "And the foreign aid package included critical security measures." "I have the voting record and bill text for both," Crockett replied calmly. She passed copies to the committee clerk. "There were no poison pills in the Veterans Bill. That's demonstrably false. It was a clean bill focused solely on housing assistance programs." Before Gaetz could respond, Crockett continued, "You've also repeatedly claimed to be, and I quote, 'the strongest defender of free speech in Congress, regardless of whether I agree with that speech or not.' Is that accurate?" "Yes, the First Amendment is non-negotiable," Gaetz affirmed, seeming relieved by the change of topic. "Then perhaps you can explain why you sponsored H.R. 5297, which would have imposed restrictions on certain forms of protest near government buildings? The bill you sponsored included criminal penalties for constitutionally protected speech activities." The hearing room had become completely silent. Even members who had been scrolling through their phones were now watching intently. "That bill was about preventing violence, not limiting speech," Gaetz responded, his voice losing some of its characteristic confidence. "I have the text here as well," Crockett said, holding up another document. "Section 4, paragraph 3, specifically criminalizes verbal confrontation designed to cause discomfort to public officials, even without any threat of violence. That's constitutionally protected speech according to multiple Supreme Court decisions, including ones you've publicly praised." Republican members were now exchanging uncomfortable glances. Democratic members were leaning forward, watching as the questioning continued. "But the most striking inconsistency," Crockett continued, her calm demeanor unchanged, "relates to your repeated calls for fiscal responsibility and balanced budgets. She displayed a montage of clips showing Gaetz denouncing government spending and deficit increases across multiple interviews and speeches. The clips showed him calling other representatives fiscally irresponsible and betrayers of future generations for supporting spending increases. Yet your voting record shows support for over $3.4 trillion in spending increases over the past 3 years, while voting against every measure that would have increased revenue to offset that spending. The Congressional Budget Office has directly linked these votes to an estimated $380 billion increase in the deficit. Gaetz's expression had completely transformed from his earlier confidence. He shuffled through his papers, clearly searching for talking points that suddenly seemed inadequate. The spending measures included necessary programs for my constituents, he finally said, his voice noticeably less assured. Including the $600 million waterfront development project that you previously called wasteful pork when it was proposed under the previous administration? Crockett asked. You're on video using exactly those words before voting to approve the identical project once committee leadership changed. The C-SPAN cameras captured Gaetz taking a long drink of water, buying time to compose himself. His usual quick comebacks were nowhere to be found. Representative Crockett, the chairman interjected, your time is almost expired. Please wrap up your questioning. Crockett nodded. One final question, Representative Gaetz. Given the numerous inconsistencies between your public statements and your voting record that I've just outlined with documentation, how do you reconcile these actions with your statement earlier today that we need representatives who maintain consistency between their words and their actions? The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. The cameras captured the exact moment Gaetz realized he had no effective response. His own words, thrown back at him with methodically documented evidence, had backed him into an inescapable corner. I believe the record speaks for itself, Gaetz finally said, attempting to sound dismissive but coming across as defensive. Cherry-picking votes without context is a political game as old as Congress itself. Crockett remained composed. These aren't cherry-picked examples, Representative Gaetz. I've provided full context, complete voting records, and your own words in their entirety. This isn't about politics. It's about the consistency and accountability you yourself have championed. She turned to address the chairman directly. I'd like to submit for the record the complete documentation of Representative Gaetz's public statements alongside his contradictory voting record on these and 17 additional issues, complete with dates, bill numbers, and video evidence. Without objection, the chairman replied, looking slightly stunned at the thoroughness of the presentation. As Crockett gathered her documents, the committee room remained unusually quiet. Reporters were frantically typing on their laptops, recognizing the historical significance of what they were witnessing. Several committee members were reviewing the documents that had been distributed, comparing Gaetz's statements with his voting record. What made this moment especially powerful was that Crockett hadn't resorted to personal attacks or political theatrics. She had simply presented facts, allowing Gaetz's own words and actions to speak for themselves. It was accountability in its purest form. A senior Republican committee member, Representative Wilson, leaned forward to her microphone. What she said next stunned the room even further. Mr. Chairman, I think we need to acknowledge the thoroughness of Representative Crockett's research. Accountability isn't a partisan issue, and I believe we all have a responsibility to align our votes with our public positions. The bipartisan acknowledgement of Crockett's evidence transformed what might have been dismissed as a partisan attack into something much more significant, a moment of genuine accountability that transcended typical political divisions. Gaetz, now visibly uncomfortable, shuffled his papers and avoided eye contact with colleagues who had previously nodded along with his bold statements about integrity and consistency. Mr. Chairman, may I respond? Gaetz asked, attempting to regain control of the narrative. Briefly, the chairman replied. What matters most is fighting for the American people, not perfect consistency on procedural votes, Gaetz began, trying to sound confident. My constituents elect me to represent their interests, which sometimes requires complex decisions that can't be reduced to simplistic comparisons. But his response, once delivered with his characteristic boldness, now sounded hollow in the face of such comprehensive evidence. The cameras captured committee members on both sides of the aisle exchanging glances that communicated a shared assessment. The explanation wasn't landing. As the hearing moved to the next questioner, something remarkable happened. Instead of the usual partisan divides reasserting themselves, several members referenced Crockett's evidence in their own questioning, pressing for greater consistency between words and actions across government. Outside the hearing room, journalists surrounded Crockett as she exited. "Representative Crockett, was this a planned strategy to focus on Gaetz's record?" one reporter called out. Crockett's response demonstrated why her approach had been so effective. "This wasn't about Representative Gaetz specifically," she explained calmly. "It was about a principle we should all uphold, that public servants should be consistent between what they tell their constituents and how they vote. Today was simply an evidence-based examination of that principle." As she finished speaking, her phone buzzed continuously with notifications. Video clips of the exchange were already spreading across social media platforms, with comments focusing not on partisan politics, but on the larger issue of political consistency and accountability. Within hours, news networks across the political spectrum were playing the footage, with analysts noting the methodical, fact-based nature of the confrontation. "What we witnessed today wasn't typical congressional theater," said one commentator. "It was accountability in its purest form, and it's resonating because Americans across the political spectrum are hungry for substance over performance." The repercussions of the hearing extended far beyond that single committee room. By the following morning, the exchange between Crockett and Gaetz had been viewed over 15 million times across various platforms. What made this moment different from typical viral political confrontations was how it transcended partisan reactions. Conservative commentator William Hayes acknowledged on his program, "Whether you agree with Representative Crockett's politics or not, what she did was simply hold another politician accountable to his own stated principles. That's something voters across the spectrum have been demanding." Progressive analyst Sophia Chen agreed. This wasn't about left versus right. It was about matching words with actions. Crockett didn't attack Gaetz's positions. She simply exposed the gap between his rhetoric and his record using indisputable evidence. For Gaetz, the impact was immediate and significant. Previously known for his aggressive questioning of others, he found himself struggling to respond to questions about his own record. At a press conference the following day, he attempted to dismiss the confrontation. "Washington is full of political theater," he told reporters. "I'm focused on the real issues affecting Americans, not playing gotcha games in committee hearings." But the response fell flat, especially when reporters immediately followed up by asking about specific inconsistencies Crockett had highlighted with documentation. When pressed on his contradictory votes on surveillance, Gaetz ended the press conference abruptly, creating another viral moment that only extended the story's lifespan. The following week, during a town hall in his district, voters who had previously cheered Gaetz's fiery rhetoric now asked pointed questions about the discrepancies between his statements and voting record. Local news captured the moment when a 67-year-old veteran stood up and said, "I've supported you for years, but I need to know, why did you tell us you'd fight for veterans' housing then vote against it? I'm not asking for an attack on someone else. I'm asking for an honest answer about your vote." The man's quiet dignity as he awaited a response created another powerful visual that quickly spread online. Gaetz's answer, which pivoted to criticizing the bill's sponsors rather than addressing its content, drew audible murmurs from the previously supportive crowd. Meanwhile, Crockett's approach received bipartisan recognition from constituents, if not always from partisan politicians. Her office reported receiving thousands of messages from citizens across the political spectrum, many expressing the same sentiment. "Thank you for focusing on facts rather than theatrics." What truly distinguished the aftermath was how ordinary citizens began applying Crockett's methods to their own representatives. Local newspapers reported increased attendance at town halls across the country, with constituents arriving armed with voting records and previous statements from their representatives. One small-town paper ran the headline, "The Crockett Effect. Voters now doing their homework before town halls." In a CNN interview 3 days after the hearing, Crockett explained her philosophy. "My background is in civil rights law, where evidence and consistency matter more than performance. I brought that same approach to Congress. This isn't about partisan politics, it's about a basic principle, that public servants should mean what they say and vote accordingly." Perhaps the most significant impact came 2 weeks later, when a bipartisan group of representatives announced a new consistency caucus, dedicated to improving transparency around voting records and public positions. The group, which included members from both parties, specifically cited the Crockett-Gaetz exchange as a catalyst for their formation. What Representative Crockett demonstrated wasn't a partisan tactic but a fundamental accountability measure that should apply to all of us, said Republican Representative Wilson, who had been the first to acknowledge the validity of Crockett's evidence during the hearing. "Voters deserve to know whether we're voting the same way we're speaking." A nonprofit organization launched a new website called Words versus Votes, creating an accessible database where citizens could easily compare their representatives' public statements with their voting records on major issues. Within 3 months, the site had over 2 million regular users and was being incorporated into civics curricula in high schools across the country. Veteran political analyst James Montgomery observed, "What we're seeing is the potential beginning of a shift away from performance politics toward substance. For years, the most successful politicians have often been those who perform best on camera, regardless of their actual voting records. Crockett's methodical approach might be signaling a return to substance over style." The impact extended to how media outlets began covering Congress. Several major networks announced they would start regularly featuring segments comparing representatives' public statements with their voting records, regardless of party affiliation. One cable news program debuted a new weekly feature called The Consistency Check, directly inspired by Crockett's approach. A more subtle but perhaps more profound change occurred in committee hearings across Congress. Staffers reported that members were now demanding more thorough briefings on their own voting histories before public appearances, aware that inconsistencies might be exposed. Some representatives even began voluntarily addressing apparent contradictions before being questioned, a practice that earned them respect even when their explanations involved acknowledging changed positions. For Gaetz personally, the episode marked a turning point. While he maintained his base of support, the confrontation had created a persistent challenge. Whenever he made bold proclamations about principles or criticized others' consistency, both constituents and reporters would ask about the documented contradictions in his own record. 6 months after the hearing, when both representatives appeared on a Sunday morning political show, though not simultaneously, the host asked Gaetz if the experience had changed his approach. After a moment of reflection that seemed uncharacteristic for the usually quick-responding congressman, Gaetz acknowledged, "It's made me more careful about aligning my votes with my statements. While I still believe my overall record reflects my principles, I recognize that consistency matters to the people I represent." When asked in a separate segment about her methodical approach, Crockett explained, "What I brought to that hearing wasn't a new political tactic. It was simply the same standard I applied as an attorney. Evidence matters, consistency matters, and accountability isn't about catching someone in a mistake. It's about ensuring that public service maintains its integrity." The exchange had done more than create a viral moment or embarrass a political figure. It had demonstrated that substantive, evidence-based accountability could break through the noise of modern politics and resonate with citizens tired of performance without substance. A year after the hearing, a comprehensive study by a respected political research institute found something remarkable. Across districts nationwide, representatives' voting patterns showed a 23% increase in consistency with their public statements compared to the previous year. The researchers attributed this Crockett effect to increased scrutiny from both constituents and media. As one voter from Gaetz's district told a local newspaper, "I don't agree with Crockett's politics, but I appreciate that she made me think more critically about whether my representatives are voting the way they claim to be. That's not a partisan issue. That's just good citizenship." The impact extended to political campaigns as well. Consultants reported that candidates were now being more cautious about making absolute statements, preferring nuanced positions that they could reasonably maintain if elected. It's harder to run a campaign based purely on rhetoric when voters are now primed to check if you follow through, explained one veteran campaign manager. The lasting legacy wasn't about who won the exchange, but how it had shifted expectations. In committee hearings across Congress, members began coming better prepared, more aware that inconsistencies between their words and actions might be exposed not through partisan attacks, but through simple, factual documentation. Perhaps most significantly, several universities reported increased applications to their public policy and political science programs, with application essays frequently citing the Crockett-Gaetz exchange as an inspiration. "I want to learn how to hold power accountable, with facts, not just opinions," wrote one applicant in an essay that later went viral. As a political science professor noted in an analysis that became required reading in many civics classes, the Crockett-Gaetz exchange wasn't revolutionary in content. Holding politicians accountable to their words is an age-old concept. What made it significant was how it demonstrated that in an era of political performance art, substance can still break through when presented with clarity, evidence, and without personal attacks. In perhaps the clearest sign of lasting impact, the phrase "getting Crocketted" entered the political lexicon, referring to being exposed for inconsistency between public statements and actual voting record. The term transcended partisan boundaries, used by commentators across the political spectrum whenever a politician was confronted with their own contradictions. This wasn't just another congressional clash forgotten in the next news cycle. It was a reminder that integrity in public service isn't measured by the volume of one's voice, but by the consistency of one's actions. It represented a potential turning point where the substance of governance began to reclaim its proper place over the theater of politics. If you found this breakdown valuable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We're committed to bringing you more substantive analysis of political events that goes beyond the sound bites. And leave a comment below. Do you think politicians should be held more accountable for consistency between their words and their votes? Your engagement helps us create content that matters.